So we're just going to do a quick overview of the endocrine system, and this is in chapter 17 of your textbook if you wanted to, reference that for looking at diagrams or whatever. But this handout kind of reviews some of the key concepts about the endocrine system. So when you think about how our bodies maintain homeostasis, the key controlling involuntary systems that maintain homeostasis in the body is the endocrine system and the autonomic nervous system. Remember, that was a division of the response by the nervous system. When we looked at like the somatic nervous system, remember that controlled voluntary skeletal muscle, and then the autonomic nervous system controls cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. So the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system are both key components of that involuntary control maintaining homeostasis. And do you remember what part of the brain controlled that both the autonomic and the endocrine systems? Kind of a really insignificant when you looked at it in the sheep brain, but it's a huge controller of homeostasis. And it starts, yeah. So when you think homeostasis, think of the other H word, and that's the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is key. So when you look at this diagram, we have this whole structure here is the hypothalamus. And there's a major gland of the endocrine system that comes off of the hypothalamus by a stalk. It hangs off of this by a stalk called the infundibulum. And there's two portions of this major endocrine gland. One is mostly nervous tissue, one is endocrine tissue, purely endocrine. So this structure up here is the hypothalamus. So if you want to label that right now, that's the hypothalamus. So we can see there's cell bodies there that are in charge of making a hormone, and then that hormone is released, is stored in the axon terminals down here in the posterior pituitary. So the gland indicated by the arrow here for number 1 is the posterior pituitary. But you can see that this gland is simply axons with axon terminals that are storing two hormones. And the two hormones that are stored in the posterior pituitary but made technically by the hypothalamus because they're directly controlled by the hypothalamus. And that is ADH, which is anti-diuretic hormone, and oxytocin. So oxytocin and ADH are the two hormones that are released by the posterior pituitary, but what controls that release 100% is the hypothalamus, which is this part of the brain up here. So technically, the posterior pituitary is made of nervous tissue. It's just an extension of the nervous system. Now we can see there's a capillary bed here. So once that oxytocin or ADH is released, it's released into the blood and carried off to the rest of the body, and it goes everywhere in the body. So that's why we call those hormones, ADH and oxytocin, because they're released to the blood. Any chemical that is released to the blood is a hormone, okay? So if we look at some other things that we saw released this semester by axon terminals, for example, acetylcholine. Acetylcholine was released into the synaptic cleft, right? We talked about that in the nervous system. That's not a hormone because it's not released to the blood. It's released to the synaptic cleft, and it's acting locally. If something is acting locally, we call it a paracrine, meaning it's not a hormone going to the blood. It's just released locally, a paracrine. We'll learn more about that in advanced A&P. So the two hormones released by the posterior pituitary is ADH and oxytocin. The part of the brain that produces the hormones listed in number 2 is what? What did we say? The hypothalamus. Yep, the hypothalamus. So then if we look at the other part of the pituitary gland, so this is the posterior. This one, if we look at it, it's not made of nervous tissue. We can see there's blood vessels and capillaries. This is made up of a cluster of endocrine cells. So this is a true endocrine gland. This is the anterior pituitary. So when you're looking at a model and you're trying to decide what's anterior, what's posterior, you need to look at the whole brain itself. So if I look at this diagram here, I can tell that this side is anterior and this side is posterior because I can see the cerebellum is here, that's on the back side, right? So I know that to my right is the posterior and to my left is the anterior. But if I had the other side of this brain model, it could be the other way around, right? So just find where the cerebellum is so you know which side is posterior, which side is anterior. So this is the anterior pituitary, and it secretes a lot of different glands or hormones here. So a couple of those hormones only tell other endocrine glands what to do. We call those trophic hormones. And some of the hormones just act on other cells and cause some change in those cells, and they're not related to endocrine control. So if you look in chapter 17, there's a number of different tables in the chapter that are kind of focusing on one particular gland. So if we look at the table for the anterior pituitary, we can see growth hormone is one of the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary. TSH, or we can just use the abbreviation, so GH is one, that's letter A, GH. And then TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. So that means that's one of those hormones that is just telling the thyroid what to do. So it's not acting throughout the body, it's just acting on the thyroid. We'll talk about that. ACTH stands for adrenal, I'll have it right down as ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which means it tells the adrenal gland to secrete, the adrenal cortex specifically, to secrete its hormones. Follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, that acts on the ovaries and testes, so that's another one of those that just tells another endocrine gland what to do. Then there's LH, luteinizing hormone, again acts on another endocrine hormone, under endocrine gland I mean, and then prolactin, PRL. So there's 6 hormones that we listed. There's only 2 of those that don't tell another endocrine hormone what to do. So 4 of the 6 just simply act on another endocrine gland and tell that endocrine gland to start doing its job. So it's like a foreman. We call these trophic hormones. So the only 2 that are not a trophic hormone, so I want you to put a little asterisk by the 2 that are not trophic hormones, and that is what 2? So FSH and LH act on the ovaries and testes. Those are endocrine hormones, are endocrine glands. Ovaries and testes are endocrine glands. ACTH acts in the adrenal cortex, an endocrine gland. TSH acts on the thyroid, which is an endocrine gland. So what's left? Growth hormone, that acts throughout the body on different cells, stimulating growth. And the other one? Prolactin, that acts on the glands of the breast, stimulating milk production. So I want you to put an asterisk by all the other 4 hormones other than PRL and GH. Those are actual endocrine hormones that act system-wide. The other 4 act on another endocrine gland and just tell it what to do its job. Okay, so we call those trophic hormones. So the little asterisk represents trophic hormones. Yes?
What was the tissue you said made up that anterior pituitary?
Endocrine tissue.
And then what was for the posterior pituitary?
Nervous tissue. Yeah, nervous tissue. All right, so in this next diagram, we're just labeling the different endocrine glands. So if we look in this first box here, this is looking at the pituitary gland. So there's an anterior and posterior version of that, right? So we can just put in parentheses anterior and posterior. And then do you remember that gland coming off the back of the thalamus that controls sleep cycles? We looked at that with the, nope, that's respiratory and heart rate. Well, it has respiratory primarily. But some people take this hormone that this secretes to help them sleep at night. you remember that one? Melatonin is the hormone. Do you remember the gland that secretes it? No? Pineal gland? And in the neck, just below the larynx, is the thyroid gland. And there's 4 tiny little masses on the thyroid gland, which is called the parathyroid gland. Then we have a mass of endocrine tissue that lies over the heart that is very active in childhood when we're developing our immune system. T cells develop here and mature here, but then as we age, it turns to fat because our immune system is fully developed, and that's called the thymus gland. And then these glands that sit on top of the kidney are called adrenal glands, but it's broken up into 2 parts. The outer margin is called the adrenal cortex, and it secretes different hormones than the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla, its job is to secrete the hormone related to the sympathetic nervous response. Do you remember what hormone is released by the sympathetic nervous system for fight or flight? Yep, adrenaline, or epinephrine is another name for it. And this gland is important for blood sugar control. What is this one? This kind of flag-shaped gland here. Yeah, yep, the pancreas. And then we have a hermaphrodite individual here with both parts. So we have the ovaries and the testes. So these are the major endocrine organs. So if we look at hormones and what gland secretes, the one that regulates calcium levels in the blood, the hormone is parathyroid hormone. We'll just call it PTH, and the gland is the parathyroid. Metabolism, T3 and T4, which comes from the thyroid gland. The fight or flight response, we already said, was epinephrine, which is also called adrenaline. And where do we say that comes from? Adrenal medulla, yep. Increasing blood sugar levels in the blood. So if you did not eat breakfast this morning, you're not crashing due to low blood sugar because of this hormone secreted by the pancreas. Do you know which one that is? Well, that decreases blood sugar levels, right? So if you're diabetic and you have really high blood sugars, you need to get artificial insulin, which is the other one, the partner to insulin. Yep, glucagon. And some people that are hypoglycemic, which means they get low blood sugars if they don't eat on a regular basis, and this is common among some women, it's because they have poor glucagon secretion. So they need to eat snacks a lot and keep that blood sugar up. So insulin and glucagon both have opposite effects on the body, and we need both to maintain our blood sugar levels because we're not constantly eating, supplying blood sugar, right? Like overnight especially. Okay, the day-night cycle to promote sleep. What hormone did we say that was? Melatonin. And the gland is what again? Yep, the pineal gland. All right, stimulating uterine contractions and milk letdown. So there's a difference between milk production and milk letdown. So milk letdown is due to oxytocin. And the gland for that, do you remember which gland that was? Yep, the posterior pituitary. And then this is only stimulating. So remember we talked about trophic hormones with the anterior pituitary? So when it talks about stimulating another gland, I want you to think anterior pituitary. Because when its only job is to kick another gland into action, that's a trophic hormone, most often coming from the anterior pituitary. So what anterior pituitary hormone stimulates the thyroid gland? Yep, TSH. And that's the anterior pituitary. Stimulates the growth of bone and muscle. What do you think? Yep, GH, growth hormone. That's again the anterior pituitary. Stimulates the ovaries and testes to secrete their hormones. So again, this is one of those, ovaries and testes are an endocrine gland, right? So if it's stimulating an endocrine gland, it's one of those trophic hormones from the anterior pituitary. Now you have to decide which one stimulates the ovaries and testes to secrete their hormones.
FSH.
Well, there's two choices, FSH and LH. When we look at the list in your lab packet, LH is the one that stimulates testosterone production and estrogen and progesterone. So it's LH in this case. And again, that's the anterior pituitary. Promotes water retention by the kidneys. So this is a hormone that we talked about in lecture, the anti-diuretic hormone. Prevents urination, promotes water to leave the collecting duct and go back to the blood. So ADH, and where do we say that comes from? Posterior pituitary. And which one decreases blood sugar levels in the blood? Insulin. And that's from the pancreas. Promotes milk production. So milk letdown versus milk production are two different things. So when you see the pro part, you're thinking of the hormone that starts with pro, which is prolactin. And that comes from the anterior pituitary. Matures T cells for a functional immune system. Thymosin, and that comes from the thymus. Supports sperm development and male secondary sex characteristics. So this is what makes men men. What hormone? Testosterone. And where does that come from? The testes. From those interstitial cells we looked at last week. Sodium reabsorption and potassium excretion by the kidneys. Talked about that in lecture. This is important for blood pressure control. It's aldosterone. And that comes from the adrenal cortex. That's the outer margin of the adrenal gland. Stimulates egg and sperm production in the ovaries and testes. Yep, that's the FSH. And that comes from the anterior pituitary. And then growth of the uterine lining and female sex characteristics. So that's one of those hormones, yep, from the ovaries. So those are some of the major hormones. There's more in your list in your lab packet, but this is just kind of an overview of the important ones that I want you to know for the lecture exam as well. So let's just summarize some information when we compare the nervous system, like the autonomic, versus the endocrine. So what does the nervous system use to stimulate different organs? Using our word bank makes life easier. What's the stimulus from the nervous system? Action potentials, yeah. So action potentials is how, like for example, when you stimulate muscle or even heart muscle, it's action potential. While the endocrine system stimulates different organs with what? Hormones, yep. So what would you predict? The effects of the nervous system stimulation are faster or slower than the endocrine? Definitely faster, yeah, because we're traveling down axons, which is rapid, especially if they're myelinated. And in the autonomic nervous system, there's two neurons in series, and the first one is myelinated, the second one sometimes is not. The nervous system highway for communication is through the, just mentioned that, axons, while the endocrine system, it is the blood. So the longer acting system is the endocrine, and the fast acting is the nervous. Okay, if you go in our folder for this week, there is a narrated PowerPoint with information about the nervous system in general, so you can review that as well.